During the 45 or so years following the end of the Second World War, Europe was divided into two armed camps. Both trained hard for a war which never took place. How did this situation come about so soon after the end of 6 years of devastating global conflict? In 1945, much of Europe, including Western Russia, lay in ruins. North Africa was littered with the debris of war. Southeast Asia, too, was devastated, its economy in ruins. China had suffered dreadfully, and few Japanese cities had escaped the ravages of American bombing. Everywhere there were people without homes, people who were starving, and people who were physical and mental wrecks. The World War of 1939-45 had been very much more total than its predecessor 25 years earlier. Of the approximately 55 million who lost their lives, 2/3 were civilians. Thus, the need to prevent armed conflict between nations in the future was even more pressing than it had been in November 1918. The League of Nations had been unable to prevent war in the 1930s. And so what could be done now to prevent what were likely to be even more destructive conflicts in the future? When British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and American President Franklin Roosevelt had their historic meeting off Canada in August 1941, they drew up the Atlantic Charter. In it they declared their hopes for a peace which will afford for all nations the means of dwelling in safety within their own boundaries. It was from this document that the United Nations was born. In January 1942, no less than 26 nations then at war with the Axis powers signed the original Declaration of the UN. 21 more would sign before the war ended. At Dumbarton Oaks, a country house outside Washington, D.C., the structure of the UN was drawn up. The city of San Francisco on America's west coast witnessed the third and final step towards the creation of the United Nations. A conference of 50 nations, again all at war with the Axis powers, was convened here in April 1945 in order to draw up the UN Charter, the blueprint for future world peace.
You members of this conference are to be the architects.
The San Francisco Conference was opened by President Harry S. Truman, and the Charter itself came into effect in October 1945.
By your labors at this conference, we shall know if suffering humanity.
Truman himself summed up the UN's underlying motivation.
If we do not want to die together in war, we must learn to live together in peace.
One offshoot of the creation of the United Nations originated in January 1942. Information about atrocities in territories occupied by the Axis powers provoked governments in exile in London to warn that these would be punished through organized justice. This was taken up by the UN, whose War Crimes Commission first met in October 1943. In that same month, America, Britain and the Soviet Union warned Germany that major war criminals would face trial for their crimes. The final Allied war conference at Potsdam, outside Berlin in July 1945, confirmed the intention to pursue war criminals. The surviving members of the Nazi hierarchy were taken to Nuremberg in southern Germany. Its stadium had housed the spectacular pre-war rallies, but now all symbols of Nazism were removed. "21 of Hitler's lieutenants were to be tried by an international military tribunal for crimes against peace, which meant waging a war of aggression, crimes against humanity, to cover atrocities against civilians, and war crimes, which were violations of the laws of war." The trial itself opened in November 1945 and was to last for 11 months. Three of the defendants were acquitted, but 10 rose at the end of the trial to hear these words.
The bill sentences you to death by hanging.
One who escaped the hangman's noose was Hermann Göring, one-time deputy Führer and also commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe. While awaiting execution, he managed to swallow a cyanide pill, which had been smuggled to him. Spandau jail in Berlin was to be the destination of the remaining defendants. Here they were guarded in turn by troops of the occupying powers. Longest serving would be Rudolf Hess, who had been Hitler's deputy until he flew to Scotland in May 1941 in a bizarre attempt to negotiate peace terms with Britain. He would never leave Spandau, dying in what some have claimed were mysterious circumstances in 1987. But individual nations also held their own war crimes trials. In many cases, those arraigned were also sentenced to death. Some of the guards of Belsen concentration camp, both male and female, and Fritz Kramer, its commandant, were hanged by the British. Those nations which had suffered German occupation also took their revenge on traitors and collaborators. Norway tried and executed Vidkun Quisling, the man who had encouraged the Germans to invade his country in 1940. The French tried and imprisoned one-time national hero Marshal Henri Pétain, who had led the Vichy government after France's defeat in June 1940. Across the other side of the world, a similar system of war crimes trials was established in Japan. General Hideki Tojo, who as Prime Minister had led his country into war, tried to commit suicide before coming to trial. He was resuscitated and took his place in court accused of crimes against peace. He too was found guilty and hanged, but not before a bizarre incident in court. Another who received the death penalty was the Tiger of Malaya, General Tomoyuki Yamashita, for crimes committed while commanding in the Philippines during its liberation by the Americans in 1944. Trials for crimes committed during the war have continued to this day, especially in Israel, where the desire to punish those involved in the Holocaust remains strong. Adolf Eichmann was sentenced to death in 1961. Klaus Barbie was imprisoned for life in France more than 25 years later. During the war crimes investigations in Europe, it became apparent that the Russians were unwilling to reveal details of Axis prisoners of war whom they were holding. this was but one indication of a worsening of relations between them and the Western Allies. Indeed, immediate post-war meetings of the occupying powers in Germany showed that the Russians were becoming increasingly uncooperative. One of the first to realize the growing seriousness of the situation in post-war Europe was former British war leader Winston Churchill, who in early 1946 undertook a lecture tour in the United States. In a speech to a largely student audience in Fulton, Missouri, on the 5th of March, he made this statement.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line,
Iron Curtain immediately became part of the English language. The Western Allies realized very early on that Germany had to be put back on its feet, which meant getting industry going again. A prime example of this was the resurrection of the Volkswagen factory, created by Hitler to produce cars for the people. The Beetle, as it became known, proved to be one of the most popular cars of the past 50 years, and is still on our roads today. The Russians, on the other hand, stripped their zone of Germany of almost everything useful. Worse came in June 1946, when the Russians forced the Western Allies to agree to stop the movement of Germans from their zone to the west. The result was the inner German border, a fence which divided Germany in two. This was contrary to what the Allies had agreed during the war, namely that Germany should be treated as one country. By this time, the armed forces of the West were going home to be demobilized. Those remaining in Germany were seen as a mere constabulary to support the zonal military governments. There were, however, few indications that the Soviet Union was taking significant steps to reduce her vast wartime military machine. There were also signs of a Soviet policy to spread communism within Europe. Greece had already suffered a bitter civil war when communist resistance groups tried to overthrow the government in the immediate aftermath of the German withdrawal towards the end of 1944. British forces had to be quickly deployed from the fighting in Italy to help crush the insurgents. In the capital, Athens, the fighting was especially fierce. Eventually, in January 1945, a ceasefire was arranged. But at the request of the Greek government, British troops remained. In 1946, communist guerrillas in northern Greece began to make their presence felt again, and a second civil war erupted. Greece complained to the United Nations that the guerrillas were being given assistance by Bulgaria, Albania and Yugoslavia, all of whom now had communist governments. The UN eventually found in Greece's favor. In Turkey too, there was much communist-fomented unrest, and her poorly equipped armed forces were in no state to resist feared incursions by the Soviet Union across their common border. There was too the thorny problem of Trieste, which Yugoslavia had claimed from Italy at the end of the war. The danger of conflict between the Yugoslavs and the Western Allies was avoided through the setting up of a free territory of Trieste, policed by American, British and Yugoslav troops. The Eastern European nations, all of whom had been liberated by Russia, were not being allowed true democratic elections during the first 2 years of peace. The result was that communist governments assumed power in Albania, Poland, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. In March 1947, President Truman, in a speech to the U.S. Congress, announced a new policy for dealing with the worsening situation. The United States would give economic and military help to any nation threatened by another country. The first beneficiaries of this were Greece and Turkey. The Truman Doctrine was to be the cornerstone of American foreign policy for the next 20 or more years. But Western Europe was still struggling to repair the damage of 1939-45, both physical and economic. This, in American eyes, made it vulnerable to the spread of communism. Consequently, in June 1947, General George C. Marshall, the wartime American Chief of Staff and now Secretary of State, announced that the U.S. was prepared to offer economic aid to help European countries get back on their feet. The Marshall Plan, as it was called, was eagerly grasped by Western European countries. Eastern European countries, especially Czechoslovakia, which still enjoyed democratic government under President Edvard Beneš, were also keen to take advantage of the Marshall Plan. Stalin, however, refused to allow this, and in September 1947 announced the formation of his alternative to the Marshall Plan, Cominform. But Czechoslovakia's days as a democracy were numbered. In February 1948, the Communists, who had a minor share of the coalition government, seized total power, arresting politicians of other parties. The climax came in March, when Foreign Minister Jan Masaryk, son of Czechoslovakia's first president, and who had been prepared to cooperate with the new government, fell to his death from a balcony. The Communists allowed him a state funeral, for he enjoyed much popular support, but there was a strong suspicion that they had murdered him. President Beneš remained in office until June, when his dislike of the Communists and ill health brought about his resignation. With his going, Stalin's grip on Eastern Europe was complete. Stalin now turned to Berlin, where, under the June 1945 Berlin Declaration, the Americans, British and French had zones of occupation in the western part of the city. This reflected acceptance by the wartime Allies that Germany should be treated as one country and have her capital eventually restored to her. On the 24th of June 1948, the Russians, without warning, suddenly sealed all road, rail and water links from the Allied zones in Western Germany to Berlin. This meant that not only was West Berlin cut off from the outside world, but its inhabitants faced starvation. Demands by the Western Allies that the Russians reopen the links were rebuffed, but the West's military strength was too weak for war. Nevertheless, the Western Allies were not going to be forced out of West Berlin. They therefore resolved to keep their zones in the city resupplied entirely by air. Thus began the Berlin Airlift, one of the most remarkable challenges faced by air power that the world has known. For almost 11 months, the U.S. Air Force and the RAF flew non-stop missions into Berlin's Gatow and Tempelhof airports, which became the busiest in the world. The aircraft delivered everything from food through soap and medical supplies to liquid fuel and, especially during the winter, coal. Aircraft leaving Berlin evacuated the sick for treatment in Western Germany. Thus the people of West Berlin survived, even though they were forced to cut down most of their trees for fuel. Eventually, on the 5th of May 1949, the Russians, who had not believed that the airlift could be maintained, conceded defeat and reopened the western land links with the city. West Berliners could breathe again, but even before the Berlin airlift, the West had begun to display greater solidarity. In March 1948, Western European nations had formed a political, economic and military alliance through the Brussels Treaty. 6 months later, the Western European Defence Organization was set up under Field Marshal Montgomery, Britain's famous wartime commander. But America too was rearming, or at least trying to. By early 1948, her ground forces, including Marines, had been run down to just over 600,000 men. Truman wanted to quadruple this, but Congress only agreed to limited conscription, which would bring in 300,000 men in the next 2 years. The truth was that most Americans believed that there were other ways of ensuring the West's security. One was through air power, especially new bombers like this massive B-36. The other was the atomic bomb, which still only the Americans possessed at the end of 1948, and which had demonstrated its awesome destructiveness in August 1945 against Japan. This was not only in the physical damage it wreaked, but also in the burns and radiation sickness from which the inhabitants of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were to suffer for years to come. But it was important that the United States be militarily bound to the defense of Western Europe. Consequently, a new defense organization came into being in April 1949. This was the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, whose 12 initial signatories were the United States, Canada, and the countries of Western Europe, including Norway, Denmark, Iceland, Italy, and Portugal. The initial Soviet reaction to NATO was hostile, yet once the treaty had been signed, there was a slight thawing of East-West relations as reflected in the ending of the blockade of Berlin and a withdrawal of external support for the communists in Greece. Meanwhile, throughout the immediate post-war years, the Americans continued to develop the nuclear weapon. To do this, they carried out a number of tests in the Pacific Ocean. They shared their growing knowledge with the British and the French, who also began to develop these weapons. The explosive power of the tests increased.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, fire!
On the 29th of August 1949, however, the Russians successfully carried out an atomic bomb test. This meant that the Cold War would now take on a new and frightening dimension. The Russians were able to develop the atom bomb so quickly after 1945 because individuals involved in the American nuclear weapons program had given them secret information, partially in the belief that the world would be more stable if both sides had the bomb. Spies like America's Rosenbergs, Englishman and defector Kim Philby, and businessman Greville Wynne, seen here at his Moscow trial, became a major part of the Cold War. By the 1970s, exchanges of spies who had been caught were regularly taking place in Berlin. But there were other methods of gaining intelligence, including the use of high-flying aircraft, like this American U-2, which used special cameras to photograph military installations. In 1957, the Russians launched the first satellite into space, and by the 1970s, these had begun to supersede the spy plane. Numerous show trials in Eastern Europe were designed as propaganda to expose capitalist designs on the communist bloc. In the United States, Senator Joseph McCarthy whipped the nation into hysteria during the early 1950s with his accusations of communist infiltration into every walk of life. Not even Hollywood was spared, with household names like Charlie Chaplin being forced to leave. The airwaves were used to disseminate each side's version of the issues of the day. Radio Moscow and Voice of America vied with one another to influence world opinion, while monitoring stations tried to identify the hidden meaning behind the propaganda. Meanwhile, a nuclear arms race was developing. On the 1st of November 1952, the United States exploded its hydrogen bomb on Eniwetok Atoll in the Pacific. Its destructive power was many times that of the bombs used against Japan in 1945. But conventional military strength was not ignored, with Soviet forces remaining strong in Eastern Europe. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, therefore began to make a concerted effort in 1952 to strengthen its own forces, especially in West Germany, which was seen to be most under threat. Here, in contrast to East Germany, the economy was making a dramatic recovery and would soon be one of the strongest in Europe. In 1953, Joseph Stalin, Russia's dictator for almost 30 years, died. Many Russians were devastated. Stalin was succeeded by Nikita Khrushchev, but Western hopes of improved relations were dashed by his refusal to countenance a reunited Germany. Khrushchev feared that this might threaten the Soviet Union, as in 1941. In 1954, Khrushchev declared East Germany an independent state. Veteran communist Walter Ulbricht became leader of the German Democratic Republic. The following year, West Germany also achieved full independence under Chancellor Konrad Adenauer as the Federal Republic of Germany. It was also made a member of NATO. German troops now joined their NATO allies in defending their new republic, while Moscow retaliated by forming the Warsaw Pact of all communist states bar one. In 1948, President Tito of Yugoslavia had broken off relations with the Soviet Union because of undue interference in his country's affairs, and maintained strong armed forces to defend Yugoslavia's integrity. Relations with the Soviet Union did improve after Stalin's death, but Tito maintained his policy of non-alignment. Even so, the creation of the Warsaw Pact formalized the two armed camps in Europe, with NATO now strengthened by the inclusion of West Germany and Turkey and Greece, which had joined in 1952. The inner German border, now consisting of barbed wire fences, minefields and watchtowers, remained the main symbol of a divided Europe. But in the satellite nations of Eastern Europe, not all, by any means, were content with Moscow's iron grip. In Hungary, matters came to a head in 1956. On the 22nd of October, the capital, Budapest, witnessed an armed uprising against the Stalinist government. It was successful, and a new administration took power under the banner of communism with a human face. But in July 1956, President Nasser of Egypt had nationalized the Suez Canal. The French and British, its traditional owners, gathered a task force and landed at its northern end in early November. Taking advantage of this crisis, Moscow had sent its tanks into Hungary on the 1st of November. They quickly crushed the liberation movement. Many Hungarians now fled to the West, and efforts to raise the matter in the United Nations founded on the Soviet Union's use of her veto. But regardless of Suez, there was little that the West could have done. Because of its conventional inferiority, NATO's military policy was now firmly based on a nuclear response to Soviet aggression. But was Hungary's plight in November 1956 worth the risk of a nuclear war? Aircraft was still the main means of delivering nuclear weapons. Typical mid-1950s types were the new American B-52 and the British V-bombers, Vulcan and Victor. They were faced by such as the Russian Tupolev Tu-20. But both sides were also developing long-range rockets, largely thanks to drawing on the expertise of the German wartime scientists who had developed the V-1 free-flight rocket. Indeed, their leader, Werner von Braun, seen here, was working for the Americans. Battlefield or tactical nuclear weapons also began to appear. These were in the shape of short-range rockets or nuclear shells fired from conventional guns. NATO ground forces in Germany recognized the need for more armored vehicles, which offered a degree of protection against nuclear blasts and also enabled troops to quickly concentrate to meet Warsaw Pact thrusts. The Russians too relied heavily on tanks and other armored vehicles. They applied much the same blitzkrieg tactics that they had developed during 1942-45. Indeed, it was their aim to reach the English Channel in just 10 days after crossing the inner German border. Initially, they saw nuclear weapons as a useful adjunct to this strategy. By the end of the 50s, however, with nuclear weapons proliferating on both sides, the Russians decided to make an initial nuclear strike and then merely use their conventional forces to exploit. Cuba was the scene of the first and most serious nuclear crisis of the Cold War. In 1959, communist guerrillas had overthrown the government. They were led by Fidel Castro. 2 years later, America, aghast at a communist regime in its backyard, supported refugees keen to topple Castro. The result was a disastrous attempt to land a force of exiles in Cuba's Bay of Pigs. Moscow was giving the Castro regime increasing help especially with weaponry. In autumn 1962, Khrushchev decided to establish a nuclear rocket base on Cuba, but American intelligence got wind of this. U.S. President John F. Kennedy now issued an ultimatum.
I call upon Chairman Khrushchev to halt and eliminate this clandestine, reckless, and provocative threat to world peace.
The world held its breath, fearful that nuclear war lay just around the corner. But Khrushchev quickly backed down, realizing that America's nuclear armory was still very much greater than his, and the missiles were removed. Cuba served to belie Khrushchev's policy, declared in 1960, of peaceful coexistence with the West. So too did an event in Berlin on the 13th of August 1961, when Berliners awoke to discover East German frontier guards constructing a wall along their boundary with West Berlin. Free access between East and West, which had so far survived the tensions of the Cold War, was now no longer possible. Too many East Berliners had been using it to escape to the West. Some continued to try and do so, but many were shot by the border guards. The Berlin Wall now took over from the inner German border as the main symbol of a divided Europe, with the lights and freneticism of capitalist West Berlin on one side and the drabness of communist East Berlin on the other. The two superpower leaders recognized this. Khrushchev visited the wall in January 1963, and Kennedy that June.
Today, in the world of freedom, the proudest boast is, Ich bin ein Berliner.
Yet in little over a year, the two had vanished from the world scene. President Kennedy was assassinated on the 22nd of November 1963 while visiting Dallas, Texas. Khrushchev was deposed by Alexei Kosygin and Leonid Brezhnev in October 1964. Now American attention began to be increasingly diverted by what was to become the long agony of Vietnam. The new Soviet doctrine began to evolve and was put into practice in 1968. Early that year in Czechoslovakia, Alexander Dubček forced the Stalinist premier to resign and took over the reins of power. This heralded what was known as the Prague Spring, a sudden liberalization in the country. This new policy was enshrined in Charter 68, which was signed by very many Czechs. The liberal regime was not to Moscow's liking, and Warsaw Pact maneuvers were held on the Czech borders. Soviet Prime Minister Kosygin visited Prague, but the Czechs refused to halt their democracy program. Fearful that this liberalization might spread to other Eastern European states, Soviet Premier Brezhnev sent Soviet, East German, Polish, Bulgarian and Hungarian troops into Czechoslovakia in August. Unlike in Budapest in 1956, there was no military resistance, and Dubček was quickly deposed. Thus evolved the Brezhnev doctrine that a threat to one Warsaw Pact member was a threat to the whole pact. Once again, the West did nothing. As in 1956, it was distracted, this time by a wave of student unrest, which was sweeping every country. But by the late 1960s, the nuclear policy of both sides had changed fundamentally from that of mutual assured destruction, or MAD. NATO evolved the doctrine of flexible response. This meant that instead of pushing the nuclear button as soon as Warsaw Pact forces struck into Western Europe, NATO's response would be graduated. Should its opponents fail to take heed, the response would be gradually strengthened until it crossed the nuclear threshold. This meant that conventional forces had a more significant role to play than hitherto. They were helped by the introduction of anti-tank guided weapons systems, like this French SS-11, which meant that more tanks could be kept in reserve to counter Warsaw Pact thrusts. But the Russians too were revising their thoughts on the primacy of nuclear weapons on the European battlefield. They also noted the growing sophistication of NATO weaponry and produced their own anti-tank missiles and attack helicopters, as well as ever more capable tanks. The Russians turned once more to their traditional concept of the high-speed offensive. If it was fast enough, it could, in conjunction with special forces, overrun NATO tactical nuclear weapons before they could be used, and hence win a war without it going nuclear. To this end, the Russians developed the concept of the Operational Maneuver Group. This was an all-arms force, supported by attack helicopters, which would drive deep into the NATO defenses ahead of the main body of the attack and disrupt command and control, as well as seizing key terrain. But while both sides were trying to delay the use of tactical nuclear weapons on the battlefield, the strategic nuclear arch continued to overshadow Europe and North America. The main delivery means remained the aircraft and the surface-to-surface missile, but they had now been joined by a third, the ballistic nuclear submarine. Thus was formed the strategic nuclear triad. This operated on the theory that all three delivery means could not be targeted at the same time, thus maintaining what was called a second strike capability. But by the 1970s, both sides were beginning to recognize that they possessed far more nuclear weapons than they required. Not only was the nuclear arms race furthering tension, it was also increasingly expensive to maintain. Thus began talks on limiting strategic weapons, the so-called SALT talks, which lasted through the 70s, with Brezhnev and US President Jimmy Carter achieving a measure of agreement. The 70s also saw another Soviet step to increase its military power. Both the Eastern and Western blocs remained wedded to creating spheres of influence in the Third World. The West enjoyed one major advantage in this, the size of its naval power, especially that of the U.S. Navy. The Russian Navy had, by virtue of its limited access to the oceans, always been the poor relation in the armed forces. But under the leadership of Admiral Sergei Gorshkov, the Red Navy began a massive expansion program. Large numbers of modern surface ships began to appear and were soon to be seen in all the world's oceans. Both sides sold arms to Third World countries in an attempt to gain influence. Conflicts like the wars in the Middle East enabled these weapons to be tested on the battlefield. Another way of gaining influence was through proxy wars. Thus Moscow supported the sending of significant numbers of Cuban troops to Angola in the 1970s to help remove the Portuguese colonial presence there and establish a Marxist regime. But by the mid-1970s, America's appetite for the Third World had been diminished by the searing experience of Vietnam. determination not to become involved in further disastrous foreign adventures resulted in a slowing down of arms spending. In 1979 came the seizure of U.S. embassy staff in the Iranian capital Tehran by supporters of the new Islamic fundamentalist regime. Failure to rescue them swelled U.S. loss of confidence. Another blow was the sudden Soviet invasion of Afghanistan just before the end of 1979, and the recognition that the West was powerless to do anything about it. But at the end of the 70s, two new Western leaders came to power: President Ronald Reagan
the Constitution of the United States,
and British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. Conscious of recent Soviet strides forward, especially in new theater nuclear weapons, they embarked on weapons modernization in order to once more achieve nuclear superiority at all levels. New theater nuclear weapons, the low-flying cruise missile and Pershing II rocket, were developed. Reagan also began to develop the highly sophisticated Star Wars anti-nuclear ballistic missile system. Reagan and Thatcher showed their preparedness to use force. The British sent a task force 7,000 miles to recapture the Falkland Islands from the Argentinians in 1982. The Americans went into the Caribbean island of Grenada the following year. Highly publicized NATO maneuvers in Germany were another indicator of this new tough Western stance. In contrast, the Russians found themselves bogged down in Afghanistan, which was becoming another Vietnam. Poor harvests added to their troubles. The strains on the economy increased as the Soviet Union strove to match Western weapons technology. Brezhnev had died in 1982. New Premier Yuri Andropov died 2 years later, and his successor a year after that. Mikhail Gorbachev, a much younger man, now came to the fore. Gorbachev realized that strains on the Soviet economy and growing unrest in Eastern Europe meant that the Eastern Bloc could no longer maintain the arms race. In a series of summit talks with President Reagan, Gorbachev reached agreement on major weapons reductions, both nuclear and non-nuclear. He also introduced a new policy of glasnost, or more openness in government in the Soviet Union, combined with increasing liberalization. Gorbachev also disengaged the Soviet forces from Afghanistan. But Eastern Europe did not follow suit, retaining hardline communist governments, especially in East Germany. But their peoples became increasingly impatient for reform, and the situation boiled over in 1989. In most Eastern European states, democratic forces gained control without violence, as in the rise of Lech Wałęsa in Poland and Václav Havel in Czechoslovakia. But in Romania, the overthrow of the dictator Nicolae Ceausescu proved to be bloody, especially in Bucharest, the capital. In East Germany, an increasing number of refugees flooded into West Germany through Hungary and Austria. Powerless to control the exodus, President Erich Honecker resigned, but events had gone too far for his successor to regain control. On the 9th of November 1989, the East German government agreed to free access between East and West Berlin. Next day, crowds gathered at the Berlin Wall and began to tear it down. Even though it would not be until July 1990 that NATO declared the Cold War to be at an end, The crowds by Berlin's Brandenburg Gate knew that the threat of war had receded below the horizon and rejoiced at the prospect of a new era of peace and cooperation. The next decade, however, would quickly reveal new tensions and conflicts.